Hey everybody, this video is called Samuel's Final Address, and tonight we're continuing our pass-through study here in the book of 1 Samuel. We're looking at chapter 12, where we're going to look at the farewell speech to Israel from Samuel. So 1 Samuel chapter 12 verse 1 through 3 says, "Now Samuel said to all Israel, Indeed, I have heeded your voice in all that you have said to me, and have made a king over you. And now here is the king, walking before you, and I am old and gray-headed. And look, my sons are with you. I have walked before you from my childhood to this day. Here I am, witness against me before the Lord, before his anointed. Whose ox I have taken, and whose donkey have I taken? Or whom have I cheated? Whom have I oppressed? Or from whose hand have I received any bribe with which to blind my eyes? I will restore it to you." So Samuel had obeyed the will of the Lord and the people and the setting of the king of God's choice over them, though he had personal reservations, personal concerns regarding a monarchy. And Samuel tells Israel that his day was over. He's practically on his way to retirement and for his next journey with God. And for Saul, this is just the beginning of his monarchy reign. And I love how Samuel is like, guys, I'm old and gray. I need to go at this time. And Samuel's sons, indeed, were not in leadership. They were a part of the assembly of God. And Samuel remembered his humbled beginnings as a child, dedicated to the Lord, serving Israel and the Lord at the tabernacle. So Samuel reflects on everything that he's done in serving the Lord here. And Samuel was a godly leader. Samuel was a shepherd for Israel for many, many years here. And Samuel reminds them that he did not defraud or oppress anyone in any way. And he simply challenged the nation, saying that if I have done anything wrong to you during my time of being the last judge, come out and forward and call me out on it. And he wanted the nation to know that he passed a good legacy of leadership to the new king Saul. And he wanted Israel to acknowledge that he did not hand Saul a mess that would need to be cleaned up. And if Saul was a poor leader, he couldn't blame Samuel like what the United States presidents like to do every time they take office. They always seem to blame the guy before them. And the fact that Samuel did not want to leave unfinished business if he wronged somebody unknowingly speaks volumes. And how many times do we ask others to call us out on our baloney if there's something that we did? It might not even be intentional, but we want to make things right. And this testified of Samuel's humbled heart. And "here I am" was said by Samuel often as it's emphasized his availability to God and the people of Israel. In verse 4 and 5 says, "And they said, You have not cheated us or oppressed us, nor have you taken anything from the man's hand. Then he said to them, The Lord is witness against you, and his anointed is witness this day, that you have not found anything in my hand. And they answered, He is witness." So, as we see, Samuel was seen by Israel as not having oppressed anybody or offended anybody. We see that he was a good, godly leader in their eyes. And Samuel used his anointed twice in this passage as he refers to Saul as the appointed king. And God was a witness of their response to Samuel. In verse 6 through 12 says, "Then Samuel said to the people, It is the Lord who raised up Moses and Aaron, who brought your fathers up from the land of Egypt. Now therefore stand still, that I may reason with you before the Lord concerning all the righteous acts of the Lord, which he did to you and your fathers. When Jacob had gone into Egypt, and your fathers cried out to the Lord, then the Lord sent Moses and Aaron, who brought your fathers out of Egypt and made them dwell in this place. And when they forgot the Lord their God, he sold them into the hand of Sisera, the commander of the army of Hazor, into the hand of the Philistines, and into the hand of the king of Moab. And they fought against each other, or they fought against them. Then they cried out to the Lord and said, we have sinned because we have forsaken the Lord and served the Baals and the Ashtoreths. But now deliver us from the hand of our enemies, and we will serve you. And the Lord sent Jerubbaal, Beden, Jephthah, and Samuel, and delivered you out of the hand of your enemies on every side, and you dwelt in safety. And when you saw that Nahash, king of the Ammonites, came against you, you said to me, no, but a king shall reign over us when the Lord your God was your king. And despite the nation being unified under the new king, Samuel still wanted to rebuke the nation for ignoring and rejecting what God had done for them without asking. And Samuel remembers God's work from the time of the Exodus until his day, as he's focusing on the history of the righteous acts, the good things that God had done for them. And Israel should remember their salvation from being in slavery and new life that God brought them into the promised land. And this was a righteous act of the Lord. And also God's chastisement on disobedient Israel to be dominated by the hand of Sisera. And one thing that oftentimes we look at the good things in life as of God, but we should recognize chastisement as one of the righteous acts of the Lord as well. And his discipline is as righteous as his deliverances. And they should remember that when they cried out to God, confessing their sins, humbling themselves in repentance before him, that he had delivered them as the righteous acts of the Lord. And Jerubbaal, as we studied back in Judges 6:32, was another name for Gideon, as we were looking back at the beginning of July. And Beden, though wasn't mentioned in Judges, perhaps he was a deliverer known in their history, but not recorded in the book of Judges. And perhaps it was an alternative spelling or name for Barak that we looked at back in Judges chapter 4, verse 6. So we don't really know who Beden was. Is he a person that is only mentioned here in the Bible once, or was it a nickname for Barak? And some believe it was for Samson or Jair. And Samuel remembered the most recent example of God's deliverance for Israel. And it was the Lord who delivered them through the hands of the judges and not themselves. In verse 13 through 15 says, now therefore here is the king whom you have chosen and whom you have desired, and take note that the Lord has set a king over you. If you fear the Lord and serve him and obey his voice and do not rebel against the commandment of the Lord, then the both of you and the king who reigns over you will continue following the Lord your God. However, if you do not obey the voice of the Lord, but rebel against the commandment of the Lord, then the hand of the Lord will be against you as it was against your fathers. So the Lord gave Israel their requests of their king. And for fear the Lord was a reminder of Joshua 24:14, as Israel was to stand in awe of the Lord. They were to submit in obedience to him as called for back in Deuteronomy 10:12 that we looked back in March. And both the people and the king were given the same command. The standard was the same obedience to God's command, regardless if you were the king or the general population. And rebel, as we know it, is to disobey and to not heed or to forsake. And we see the echoing of the promises of Deuteronomy 28 that we looked at back in April. There would be blessings for obedience and curses for disobedience to the commands of the Lord. And Samuel reminds them that they were not an exception of their fathers, and God wouldn't deal with them any differently than what he did with their fathers. In verse 16 through 18 says, "Now therefore stand and see the great thing which the Lord will do before your eyes. Is today not the wheat harvest? I will call to the Lord, and he will send thunder and rain, that you may perceive and see that your wickedness is great, which you have done in the sight of the Lord, in asking for a king for yourselves." So Samuel called to the Lord, and the Lord sent thunder and rain that day. And all the people greatly feared the Lord and Samuel. So through rain, the wheat harvest was right around late May or early June. It was unusual, and the Lord had sent the rain and thunder to authenticate Samuel's words to the people. And we see an impressive example of the power of prayer here. And Samuel in Psalm 99 verse 6 is referred to as a mighty man of prayer. In verse 19 says, "And all the people said to Samuel, Pray for your servants to the Lord your God, that we may not die, for we have added to all our sins the evil of asking a king for ourselves." So we see the response of the people to the power of God was their recognition of their sinful motives and asking for a king. And they were asking Samuel's prayers to intercede on their behalf. In verse 20 through 25, to wrap up the chapter, it says, "Then Samuel said to the people, Do not fear. You have done all this wickedness. Yet do not turn aside from following the Lord, but serve the Lord with all your heart. And do not turn aside, for then you would go empty after empty things which cannot profit or deliver. For they are nothing. For the Lord will not forsake his people for his great name's sake, because it was pleased the Lord to make you his people. Moreover, as for me, far be it from me that I should sin against the Lord in season to pray for you, but I will teach you the good and the right way. Only fear the Lord and serve him in truth with all your heart, for consider what great things he has done for you. But if you still do wickedly, you shall be swept away, both you and your king." So verse 20, serve the Lord with all your heart. It was often expressed covenant requirement as seen back in Deuteronomy chapter 10 and 11. In verse 21, empty things are speaking of idols. And Samuel didn't minimize their idols. He didn't beat them down on about having the idols, but he called them to go on walking with the Lord. And despite their past, God showed favor towards Israel, not because of what they did or promised to do, but for his glory, as it gave him great pleasure. And, it reminds me of our own salvation, that God saved us not according to our righteousness, but through his mercy. And the reasons were in him, not Israel. And Samuel knew the best he could do for Israel was to pray for them without ceasing. And he wouldn't only pray for them, he would faithfully teach them. And Samuel wanted the people of Israel to know that even though Saul was becoming their leader now, Samuel wasn't going away totally. He was still going to be there to disciple them, to teach them. And he would serve them through prayer as well. And in verse 25 is sad, as this sad warning became a sad legacy when they were conquered and taken from the land of captivity. And so to wrap up the chapter here, we looked at Samuel talk about his leadership over Israel. And we saw Israel confirm the blameless leadership of Samuel. And we see that Samuel goes on to be a historian. He gives a brief history lesson as he challenged Israel to serve God under the new king. And we should recognize that God's chastisement is one of his righteous acts. And Hebrews 12 shows us that he is a loving father who disciplines those that he loves. And Samuel reminds Israel that they had a choice to either fear the Lord or be chastised by the Lord for their disobedience. And they were to submit to God in obedience, or we saw God confirm Samuel's word with a sign as well. And following the sign, Israel saw their sin of desiring a king. And we see at the end that Samuel encourages Israel to walk right with the Lord today. And we see once again that Samuel was a man of prayer that us men should aim to be. And many today, you probably said this yourself, you say, oh, I promise I'm gonna pray for you, I'm gonna start praying for you, and then you don't. You know, Samuel wasn't like that. Sometimes when we know that we need to pray for someone or something, we need to stop what we're doing in our tracks and pray right there, because in our minds we're gonna forget. And you know, when you say you're gonna pray for someone and you don't, that is a breaking of a vow. And so we see that Samuel also fulfills 1 Thessalonians 5:17, as he was a man who prayed without ceasing. And I believe Samuel's statement is something that church leaders must take to heart if they stop praying for those who are under them. And if a church leader is not praying for their people, I strongly believe that they are in sin. And it's one of the essential responsibilities as a church leader or a under shepherd. And all we do in ministry, our obedience and love for God, is because of the great things that he has done for us. And if your motive isn't to serve God because of the great things he has done for us, and it's focused on yourself, you need to re-examine yourself. And we don't serve God to persuade him to do great things, because God has already done great things for us. And we can only keep perspective in our Christian lives if we focus on the great things that God has done for us. No matter what trials come up in our lives, no matter what situations that try to bring us down, we need to go on and serve the Lord, because he has done great things for us. And if we lose that perspective, we lose everything. Everything is altered at that point. And so we're going to wrap up the video right here. And I thank you for joining in this weekend. And we'll see you next, as we'll look at Saul's disobedience this upcoming week. So God bless, and have a great rest of your weekend.